Welcome back to another episode of the Mailbox, wherein I respond to questions. In this case, I'm responding to real questions from real students from a college biology class. These are mostly juniors and seniors who wish to go to medical school, and they have asked a number of questions in a discussion forum, and I am responding to those. So as you listen to my answers, please keep that in context, that I'm responding to a group of students and I'm trying to provide them feedback on, I'm trying to answer their particular question, but I'm also trying to address like what their fundamental question is, right? Get down to the root of the assumptions of their question and then try to use that question as sort of a teaching moment as I respond to it. So with those caveats in place, let's take a look at today's question. I titled this question, Possible to Stop Evolving? Some scientists believe that humans are at their peak and that we won't evolve any further. And some scientists believe that every organism continues to evolve and humans aren't an exception. I believe that humans are still evolving, but I wonder if at some point organisms, including humans, might stop evolving and reach their peak. Do you think humans are still evolving? And do you believe that at some point organisms will stop evolving? Okay, once again, I really like this question because it enables me to respond to some misconceptions. Okay, I can answer these questions very simply and very quickly. Do I think that humans are still evolving? Absolutely. Do I believe that at some point organisms will stop evolving? Absolutely not. All right, Joel, why can you just give such straightforward, simple answers to those? Well, I mean, they're the correct answers. So what do you mean by that, Joel? All right, let's unpack this question a little bit more. What are we really talking about here? Some scientists believe that humans are at their peak and they won't evolve any further. Now, I'm going to point out that this is a misconception right here in the very first part of this sentence. All right, the idea that organisms are somehow not even just humans, that any organism is evolving to some peak is as it's suggesting that organisms are striving for a particular endpoint, right? And then once they reach that endpoint, that's the prescribed goal, right? And so that means they've reached the peak or the pinnacle of their evolution. Well, it's important to note that evolution doesn't have predetermined endpoints or fixed goals, right? We've stressed that many times. Evolution is an ongoing process. Right? It's the interactions between organisms and their environment. Organisms are constantly interacting with their environment. Organisms are constantly experiencing mutations. And you put those two things together, it's not possible for an organism not to change over time. And so first thing I had to do is define evolution here. We're defining evolution in the simplest sense of organisms changing over time, or their allele frequencies, right? Their genetics. The frequencies of their various alleles, their programs, right? Changing over time. That process never stops. It's hard to conceive of a way in which the programs won't actually change over time out into the future. Some organisms might reach a really stable state. And so that's what we need to spend a couple minutes talking about. That's why I'm going to spend time on this particular question. And we're not just moving on to the next one. Right, we're going to talk about the fact that some organisms reach a stable state in their ecological niche, right? So if you have an organism that lives in an environment that is not changing at all, then what we could think about is what will happen to that organism over time. You could conceive of that organism becoming better and better and better and better adapted to that particular environmental condition, right? Same temperature, same amount of moisture, same amount of light each day. Or you could go down a list. And if you went down this huge list of environmental factors, and they all remain the same, including all the competition, right? The other organisms that are surrounding it and living in its environment. If none of those things changed, then that organism would become better and better and better adapted to that particular set of environmental constraints. And you could look at that as the organism reaching, well, see, I don't like to use the word peak. The better word be to say is they might reach some sort of maximal fitness for that particular environment. They become more and more fit for that in particular environment. So I added a figure here. Right? This wasn't included in the student's question. I just included it to help me answer the question. So what you're looking at there is the basic results of Richard Lenski's experiment with E. coli, in which he took a single E. coli, in this case we're looking at a single E. coli bacteria, allowing that bacteria to grow and replicate, right? And then every day starting a new colony from a sample from that colony, and then allowing it to replicate again. And then growing up hundreds of millions of bacteria, and then taking a sample of that, and then growing again and growing again. Now, the important thing here is it's grown in the same environment, right? The flask is shaken the same way every day. It's held at the same temperature every day. They're given the same amount of food every day. They're given the same type of food every day. They're given the same amount of light every day. So their environment is kept constant. And so in this case, what they did was, starting with a bacteria that didn't live in that exact environment, so they're introducing it into a new environment. They allow that bacteria to grow, and as that bacteria divides, right, replicates, of course that bacteria makes mistakes as it copies its genome. As it makes those mistakes, some of those mistakes end up benefiting the organism such that future generations of that bacteria gain the capacity to survive more efficiently in that particular environment. In other words, they become more fit for that particular environment. And that's what this chart is showing. 1.0 would be a fitness of 1, relative fitness. To all other organisms in that environment at that particular point, they all have the same fitness. But at a later point, 1.2 would be saying for every 10 bacteria that were produced by the original bacteria over a certain amount of time, this bacteria can have 12 offspring over the same amount of time, 10 to 12. And so that other bacteria is out competing the other one, right? Because it has more offspring. So eventually in that same environment, this new bacteria that has a new mutation is able to outcompete its ancestor, replacing it. But of course it continues to have mutations, which then create new bacteria that outcompete its ancestor or ancestral genome. And then they then replicate faster. They become more fit for the environment. Now, what you see here is you see that these bacteria very quickly over the space of the first 10,000 generations, right? 10,000 generations of bacterial growth. And through those first 10,000 generations, they accumulated a number of mutations that quickly allowed them to adapt to that particular environment. But as they adapt to that environment, they get better and better and better using that resource. They kind of run out of new innovations to come up with to get any better at living in that environment, right? They use up the food, as quickly as they can. There's only so much food available, and they're not given any more until the next day, till the next cycle begins. And so they become, in a way you can think of them, they've become as efficient as they can possibly be. I'm actually inaccurate in that. They're as efficient as they could still potentially become more efficient, but it's becoming harder and harder and harder for them to find the extremely unique mutations they'd have to have in some sort of combination in order to achieve a new fitness level. But getting kind of technical there, but what I'm trying to stress here is that there really isn't any end to getting better fit. But practically speaking, the bacteria after 50,000 generations have reached a stable state, right? They're not really gaining fitness. So they have kind of gotten to a point of stasis with respect to how they operate, right? And so they'll continue that way. Potentially they could find ways to get a little bit better, but they may also continue for long periods of time. And so I think it would be understandable if somebody looked at that and said, well, they've reached the peak of their evolution. Now, again, that's all relative. Maybe they've reached the peak, or I'll say maximal fitness for this particular environment. But I'm giving a caveat, right? I'm saying for this particular environment. If that environment changes at all, that organism isn't at maximal fitness for any other environment. So if we were to slightly change that environment, what would happen? We'd see continued adaptation, and that bacteria would change in order to become more fit for that new environment. And so change would continue. Does this mean that change continues until maximal fitness is reached and then change stops? But I want to remind you we've talked about molecular evolution, not just phenotypic changes in organisms, all right? They're traits changing. The actual genes will continue to change. The DNA sequence will continue to change, right? And in that sense, evolution continues because evolution is just change, right? Genomes changing over time. And so these bacteria, if you were to come back 100,000 generations, 500,000 generations later, even if you kept them in the exact same environment, would you predict that they would have the same genome 100,000 generations later? No, I would expect that they would have a number of different genetic differences. But those genetic differences would essentially be neutral with respect to their fitness. They might still have the same fitness level. You compete the descendant 500,000 generations now with this particular bacteria at 50,000 generations, and they may produce roughly equal numbers of generations over the same amount of period of time, all right? So that's one way of measuring fitness. And so they're equally fit for that environment. But I could compare those two bacteria and find out they actually have a lot of differences in their DNA, in their DNA sequence. But the places where those differences are don't make radical differences in their function, right? They're neutral differences, or one bacteria might have a change that actually improves its fitness for a particular gene. At the same time, there's another mutation that decreases the fitness of another particular gene. And the two combined equal the same amount of fitness for the overall fitness of the organism. And so you can have constant tweaking of genes such that some are getting a little more efficient, some are getting less efficient. As long as it's balanced off, you still can maintain those particular mutations over many, many, many generations. Right? It's not that every single gene is always getting better. So, I guess what I'm saying here is I'm just trying to show you that the part of the answer to the last question. Do you believe at some points organisms will stop evolving? Well, now, organisms can reach what appear to be static phases in their populations, right? As a species, the species may not look like it changes for long periods of time. They probably actually do have more morphological differences than you realize, so actual adaptations to environments that are slightly different. But even if we were to acknowledge that they were extremely similar morphologically, such that it would be hard to say that one was a different species, the fact that they're separated by millions of years means they probably have hundreds of thousands of, or if not tens of millions of changes in their genomes. And they may be completely incompatible with each other. If you were to be able to take that ancestor and bring it back to the present in a time machine and then introduce it to its descendant and say like, oh, are you the same species? Well, what's one way that we determine species? One way out of the many, but the biological species concept. Might introduce them together and they'd be like, we're incompatible. We have too many differences in our genes and they create incompatibilities. And so, the embryo spontaneously aborts because of those radical differences in the genome, despite our looking very similar. In which case, that would show you that the organism actually has changed and it continues to change over time. Right? So there is no organism on Earth. There's no organism. There's no population. Right? There's no species on Earth that isn't constantly incurring change. All right. So that's the last part. So are humans still evolving? Yes, right? The next generation of people, right, from this generation will not be exactly like the current population. I'm not saying they're going to not be human beings, right? You can have the same species persist for hundreds of thousands of generations, but they're always changing. They're not necessarily changing in a particular direction, or not being forced to change in some radical way and take on entirely new characteristics, especially if they're living in an environment that they're somewhat adapted to already, right? If there's no environmental pressure to change the way an organism operates, then it will maintain its basic operations, even as it is tweaking all kinds of other things along the way and having, what we call neutral evolution, random changes at neutral sites that don't have any effect on the phenotype of the organism. All right, so is it possible to stop evolving? No. And that's the whole reason we talked about Hardy-Weinberg as sort of a null hypothesis, right? If you don't have any, if you have really large populations, if you have random mating, if you don't have mutations, if you don't have any natural selection, you don't have any sexual selection, right? You don't have any genetic drift. These are all the different forces. These are all the different mechanisms by which allele frequencies can change over time. If you were to stop all of those different kinds of mechanisms from operating in this world, then organisms would not change. Right? There wouldn't be any way for them to alter their allele frequencies and recombine to form new combinations of things. And they would run out of variation as well, as we're going to see in another question. So I just go back to the last part of the first sentence and says, and some scientists believe that every organism continues to evolve. I'd like to meet some of the scientists who don't believe that. The question suggests that some scientists don't believe that organisms continue to evolve. Now, if you want to define evolution in a, what we'll call it, a macroevolutionary way, all right, in a large sense evolution of the development of new characteristics, all right, new complex traits. There are some organisms that may not be doing that or ever do that for tens of millions of years and hundreds of millions of years, right? You look at dragonflies, and dragonflies are essentially the same body plan, all right, since a long time ago, right? They haven't evolved any significant new traits. Now, I say significant, I'm talking about just morphological traits. They may have new physiological traits, adaptations to the types of food they eat, and new metabolic processes or something like that we can't really investigate. So I don't want to say that they haven't changed at all in some large sense, but at least with respect to their external morphology, they haven't evolved in that larger sense of what I think most students, such as yourselves and anyone else out there listening, usually that's what they're thinking in their mind is the word evolution. All right. And that's why I said I have a simple answer for this question. Right. But it's not so simple because most people don't perceive that question to be, do you think humans are still evolving? Right. And they're thinking, are humans going to evolve into some kind of other organism? Right. Could they learn how to fly? Could they, what kind of things are going to happen to humans in the future? And are they still evolving? But yes, they are evolving. Will they learn how to fly? Almost certainly not. But they are changing. All right, I'll leave the whole, like, how far can that change go in terms of humans, because that's always an interesting question with respect to artificial selection and a bunch of other characteristics. So organisms are, in some aspects, you can think of most of the organisms alive today that are healthy and continue to reproduce and fill some particular niche in some particular environment, that they are at their peak, right? And peak here, I just mean they're at a high level of fitness. And that's witnessed by the fact that they're survivors, right? They're still alive. They're not extinct, right? So they have achieved the ability to survive in this particular environment. But they're not at a peak in the sense that they're going to stop evolving now, right? They kind of have to continue to change, as all organisms do. All right, so possible to stop evolving? Not really. No organism really has that choice. They can't just decide, I'm not going to change, right? Change is going to happen. It's just a question of how much change and how radical that change will be. Those are the more interesting questions that come out of this. Okay, let's stop there.